This is Roberta Foster, and welcome to today's edition of the Author's Corner, brought to you by KNEO 91.7 FM, The Word. And today I welcome Chris Pappalardo to Author's Corner. He and Clayton Greene wrote the book, Building Spiritual Habits in the Home, Small Steps You Can Take Today. And it's published by Moody Publishers, and he'll tell you more about how to find the book at the end of the program. Let me introduce our authors to you. We won't be speaking with him today, but Clayton Greene is CEO and co-founder of Good Kind, and together with friends, Clayton and his wife Kristen created Advent Blocks, a devotional practice to help them anticipate Jesus during the month of December. And Clayton is also the Summit Collaborative Director, where he supports 70 plus independent church plants. Wow. Well, Chris is the author and co-founder of Good Kind and the makers of Advent Blocks, an organization that helps people cultivate the good kind of habits and holiday celebrations. He's also pastor, editor, and writer at the Summit Church in the Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina area. So, Chris, thank you so much for being with us today.
I'm so glad to have the chance to get to talk with you.
Well, we mentioned the word blocks in the introduction, and right on the front of your book are these building blocks. And of course, we're talking about building spiritual habits in the home. I found it very interesting that at the beginning of your book, you have first things first. And so you have 5 different points that you make that needs to be understood before even delving into how to have good devotional practices. Can you tell us about those 5?
Yeah, we actually wrote these 5 things at the very end because we were excited about all the practical stuff, saying, oh, wow, man, if you just do X, Y, and Z, you can get better at these spiritual habits. And then it was only towards the end that we said, oh, my goodness, we really need to let people know, like, what the theological roots for all of this are. And that's where we started and said, okay, hey, before we get to any of that, here are our operating principles we've had from the very beginning that influence the way you approach spiritual habits, not just the nuts and bolts, but the spirit you do it. And so it's things like, number 1, God start, that everything in our spiritual life is initiated by God, which should take some of the pressure off and should make us more responsive to Him rather than just hard charging for Him. That's a big one. Another is, the second one is that God wants to be with you. So this is the idea that our spiritual habits, the goal of them is not some kind of scoreboard or checklist, but it's a relationship. And if that's the point of reading the Bible or praying, we're going to approach that differently than if we have some other kind of target. So that's just a couple. There's several more, but we start with those because you build on the right foundation. You can go really high. If you have a faulty foundation, Jesus said this, the whole thing could come down at any minute.
Well, and the word at the beginning, in the chapter is called spiritual habits. So what would you define what that really is?
Yeah, we actually went back and forth about what to call this. The things we talk about are things that most Christians would recognize. Reading the Bible, praying, attending church on the weekend, practicing Sabbath. So most people would think, oh, I know those things. Those are what we would call spiritual practices or spiritual disciplines. We call them habits because what we're doing in the book is trying to take all the wisdom of the Bible and fuse it with all of the wisdom from habit science, which is another category people have, things like the book Atomic Habit and all that stuff, which is immensely practical and saying, hey, if you can look at these spiritual disciplines and think of them as habits that you actually have the tendency, have the capacity to cultivate, it'll, you'll have better skills to actually instill those habits because it's habitual practice that ends up bearing fruit over 5, 10, 15 years.
Well, since you helped write the book and kind of diagnosed what it takes to put these spiritual habits in the home. As you were writing this, did you find some practices that you actually started in your own devotional practice in your home?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, I'm sure you find this with your others all the time, it does a lot of soul searching when you suddenly write a book and you're telling the world, hey, here's how you do something.
Right.
Make you take a step back and say, oh my goodness, am I doing it?
Right.
If I'm not doing this, how could I tell anybody? But I think that's God's Spirit working on us as we teach. We also learn. So a big one for me, I know a lot of Christians struggle with Sabbath, and that's been hard for me too. We just live in such a 24/7 world that, ironically, even as we were putting the book together, I was tempted to let it bleed over into time that I knew this should be time to rest, to worship, and to spend with my family. And so it was kind of a gut check for me to say, do I really believe what I've written in here about the spiritual habit of practicing Sabbath enough to put this aside and let Sunday be God's day so that I can stop all of my very good work and enjoy all of God's very good work?
So one of the things that you talk about in spiritual habits is that they should be easy, and not just easy, but ridiculously easy. So that's not a phrase I hear too often. What does that actually mean in your book?
Yeah, we got that directly from Jesus. And we almost didn't say easy because it sounded wrong. Like, this sounds inappropriate to say that Christianity should be easy. Because a lot of times when you listen to the words of Jesus, it doesn't sound easy. He says, you're sheep among wolves, take up your cross. Like, there's a lot of difficulty. But then he also turns around and says, hey, my yoke is easy and my burden is light.
Yeah.
So we started there and said, okay, if he really meant what he said, then something about the Christian life should feel like we're putting on an easier yoke and we're taking burdens off people's shoulders instead of putting them on. So what we try to do is say, all right, where are we making this harder than it has to be? Because it's going to be hard anyway, but are there places we've complicated it too much and taken a big burden and put it on people's shoulders? So, for instance, we talk about, prayer is a good example. All of us want to be praying a lot. But the thing we tend to do wrong is to say, all right, I'm going to pray a lot. Here's my new resolution for every day starting tomorrow. I'll pray for 45 minutes first thing in the morning. And maybe you gut it out for a day, 2 days, or a week or two if you're really disciplined. But it doesn't sustain because you set a huge first step as your target.
Yeah. Now,
contrast that with saying, all right, tomorrow I'll set the alarm. I will pray for 2 minutes. And that's all you do. That's your target. That habit is almost so easy. You're like embarrassed to share it with other people, right?
Right.
Like,
I prayed for 2 minutes today.
Yeah. And honestly, you don't want to stay there for the next 20 or 30 years.
Yeah.
But if you do that once, twice, 3 times, however many days, you start to develop a rhythm and some momentum, and you don't feel like a failure. So if you set smaller targets, the habit scientists are saying this all the time, you build a sense of momentum and you get this identity, hey, you know what? I am the sort of person who prays. I can do this. And that'll propel you to more growth than a big spurt early on where you flame out and feel like a failure and then lay it aside for 6 months.
Well, today I'm talking with Chris Pappalardo about the book, Building Spiritual Habits in the Home, Small Steps That You Can Take Today. It's published by Moody Publishers, and you are listening to Author's Corner. And I wanted to just let you know that if you miss any part of today's interview or would like to hear it again, you can now find it on your favorite podcast provider or through kneo.org. So your book shows these building blocks, and inside the book contains 6 key shifts that translate good intentions into actual practice. Why don't you share a couple of those with our listeners?
Sure. You already mentioned the first one, and probably the biggest one is to make it easy. The second one is to make it tangible. The third is to pick a place. Like, environment matters a lot. The fourth is to choose your timing. The fifth, this is one of the most surprising ones we have, is to make it playful. And the last one we say is find your friends. Let me just park on the playful one for a minute.
Yeah.
This started for us because we're trying to do stuff with our children. My kids are 7 and 10, and I want to invite them in to what I'm doing as I follow Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And there's only so much inviting in you can do when it's at the grown-up level. You have to modify it some for a 7-year-old.
Sure.
And what we've learned along the way is if you modify something so a 7-year-old can do it, it doesn't just benefit the 7-year-old, it also benefits you as the grown-up.
Mm-hmm.
And then a lot of what we should do here is make our spiritual practices and habits playful so that kids can be involved, but also so that we take ourselves a little less seriously and put ourselves in a posture of humility before God.
Mm. So as you are going through this yourself and Clayton, did you find your friends talking this over perhaps with family and friends? Did you get a surprise reaction from them?
I tried not to take it as an insult, but they were like, "Oh, really? I didn't know you had anything to share there." But no, mostly they were pretty thrilled about this. Clayton and I have been for years now creating products that help people do this.
Okay.
You already mentioned Advent blocks, which is a physical, tangible Advent practice with these blocks that move along the mantle, and it fully reveals a message and the story of God coming to earth to stay.
Okay.
We have other things that help people. Like, if you put this in your home, it'll cultivate the conversations you want. So this book, when we mention it to friends, they're like, oh, this is just you explaining why those products work so that people don't have to go buy them. They can start to reverse engineer that for themselves, making their own tangible things, creating their own habits in their own homes.
Well, and that sounds like a positive result, because you may not have the blocks and things of their own when they get a copy of your book. It'll be very encouraging to them. Okay, Chris, tell us about a time that you found a mistake or a course correction was needed in your own spiritual life that would help our listeners to feel better about finding the spiritual habits to be developed for themselves.
Yeah, that's a great question. Like I mentioned, we created this product called Advent Blocks, which we used all throughout December, and found that our kids were totally locked in and loved doing these evening stories where we would do the story from the Bible. That finished, and our family decided, that was so good, why don't we do this all the time? And so we didn't quite have the curriculum or know what we were going to do next, but we thought if it was good for that little stretch of time, it'll be good kind of indefinitely. And we really tried to keep that same rhythm, but January, February, it got to be such a slog, and our kids were resenting the time. So we laid it aside and totally felt like a more spiritual family would have kept going, but we felt like failures. What we realized looking back on it is that it's always good to be reading Scripture, but the rhythm of what that looks like can change from one week to another, one season to another. And especially when you have little kids, you have to give yourself the liberty to say, okay, that works for a little while for that season. Now we're going to do something different.
Okay.
So that's a big one that I wish I had realized earlier on. That just because it works for a while doesn't mean you got to do it forever. And when you stop a habit like that, it doesn't mean that, there are other reasons to stop other than failing.
Yeah. And then, of course, with the Advent blocks, that's obviously something that can be picked up again the next year.
The next year, yeah 100%.
And so as you put this book together, what were you hoping would be at least one of the outcomes of when people read your book?
I have always loved when I read books that I get new ideas, but I tend to get a little overly excited and read it and say, all right, everything in my life is wrong, and so this book is going to fix it, and I'll go and do all of it. So this book is structured slightly differently, where there's still a ton of ideas where you could take it and run.
Okay.
But a lot of what we do along the way is pause to say, hey, take a look at what's actually happening in your life already, and recognize and name the things that are already working. Don't just focus on what you're not doing right. Focus on the areas where you actually are doing these spiritual habits and build on that. So that is the biggest thing I hope people take away from this, is recognizing, oh, wait, I do go to church on the weekend with my family. Yes, that counts. How can I make that more meaningful? As well as getting a few other kind of small hacks to say, all right, I actually feel like I could try that. You know that feeling when you I don't know, you read an article or you see something on Instagram, and it is so simple that you're like, I feel like an average person, could actually do that.
Yeah.
That's the attitude we have with this book, that it's not like, oh, that's for super Christians, but the average person will say, oh, no, wait, I could literally do that tonight.
And, of course, if it's a young couple just getting started, your book could be what they need to get started in a way that will, as their family grows, continue to be an encouragement and instruction for them as well. Yeah,
absolutely. You've heard that discipleship is caught more than it is taught.
Yes.
And so a lot of the benefit of this book is actually going to be for the adults that read it. Okay. And a lot of it's not even focused on doing things with kids, but saying, if you establish the right spiritual habits in your life, then if and when you have children, they will benefit from that, not because you're applying the stuff in the book, but because they're watching a life that is actually being formed by Jesus and following Jesus.
So one more time, the book today is Building Spiritual Habits in the Home, Small Steps That You Can Take Today, written by Chris Pappalardo and Clayton Greene. And we thank Moody Publishers for giving us a copy of the book to talk about. So, Chris, how can people find a copy for themselves?
The best place is to just go to Amazon, and if you look for Building Spiritual Habits in the Home, it'll be the first one that pops up.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. This is Roberta Foster in the Author's Corner. Join me again next time.